Much controversy and consternation at SEC Media Days, minus the media picks, but consider the scribes and the TV guys' track record through the years. Maybe that should have been a source of controversy. And Big 12 expansion, how does it affect the SEC? We'll discuss. Welcome to SEC Breakdown. We come your way each week on a Wednesday night. We release it for your viewing and listening pleasure on a Thursday morning. Chad Neipling, David Waters, Mike Loveall, and myself, Mark Rogers, bringing you SEC football talk each and every week. So, guys, good to see you, and need to let everyone know before we get cranked up here tonight that you need to join us on Twitter and also on Facebook at SEC Breakdown. We are getting you set for week one of college football in the SEC in particular. So, let's talk about these SEC media picks. So, Chad, you were down at SEC Media Days once again this year. Got down to Hoover and took part in the annual predictions that are made, the media picks, on Thursday. And it turned out, to no surprise of anyone, that Alabama gained the number one spot in the West, followed by LSU, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, Arkansas, Auburn, and Mississippi State. So let's start in the West. And despite the Football Index power ranking of ESPN going to LSU to win the West and the SEC at like 32%, almost three times the percentage power ranking of Alabama, the media still loves the Tide.
Yeah, I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon as far as, you know, the dismantling or the trust in the Tide. And to be quite honest with you, it's the safe pick. I mean, I think we've all had pretty lengthy discussion on the air and when we talk prior to this being to us going on the show, you know, when you look at the SEC West, the gap between the teams at the bottom to the teams to the top is becoming so narrow now in the Western Division. I mean, you see it in recruiting. You're starting to see schools even like Mississippi State and Arkansas, who previously were not pulling in five-star recruits, have picked up five-star recruits in the last couple cycles. So, I mean, you start thinking about the recruiting that's going on. You've got guys, if you take a look and you follow recruiting, you'll see guys are decommitting from Alabama, you know, which has always been that school that's been killing it on the recruiting trail. And they're either A, ACC schools, or B, even picking schools that may be ACC or another conference. You're starting that. So I don't think you know, as far as the confidence in Bama, I think it's just really, to be quite honest, it's the safe pick. You know, if you're voting and you're looking, and you're really looking over the SEC West, this year is just really, to me, I think with the quarterback questions, I think with, you know, some coaching changes that we've seen, there are definitely, I think there are definitely a lot of questions, and I think Alabama's just the safe pick, Mark.
So the thing that stands out to me is actually the bottom more so than the top. I expect Alabama at this point probably going to be my pick. I have yet to release the official pick, but it's going to be between Alabama and LSU. And like Chad said, I think the default selection for most of us is Alabama because we just trust the coach, we trust the process, we trust the recruiting, and we trust the development of that talent. We don't trust the quarterback position at LSU. We don't trust Les Miles necessarily making the right calls in the right situations. But looking at the bottom, okay, you go to every other division in college football, Pac-12 North and South, it's got its Oregon State, it's got its Colorado. You go to the Big Ten, it's got its Rutgers in Maryland, it's got its Purdue in the West. We could go on and on. I could take you through the rest of them. The SEC East still has Vandy, and now South Carolina obviously having a down time, and Mizzou most likely falling down as well after a 5-win season. But the SEC West, there are no bad teams. There is going to be a really good team finish 7th place in the SEC Western Division. David, what stands out to you in looking at these media picks?
Personally, for me, I've been in preseason magazine heaven, you know, for probably the last, you know, month and a half, and everyone I've seen, you know, has Georgia ahead of Florida's second in the East, and I was really surprised when the media picks came out that Florida was picked ahead of Georgia. A lot of the same media members I would think from those magazines are also in Hoover for media days, so their picks, and I guess, got outweighed by the people who I guess don't do preseason magazines and got Florida second. I don't know how much changes once these media members get in front of the teams while they're actually there. Do decisions change from Monday to Thursday when these things are filled out? Once they get in front of these players, once they get in front of these coaches, do their opinions change a good bit? And I've never been there at SEC Media Days. Mark, I know you were there years ago. Chad was, could probably speak a lot about that. I guess when you're in front of these guys, can they really say anything to sway an opinion or one way or the other? If you're neutral on two teams, is there one thing that can be said that maybe sway you one way or the other? And and I do agree with your looking at the bottom. I mean, Mississippi, you go to other conferences and pick a last place team that the media picks and see if any of them has been ranked number one in the last season or two, like Mississippi State was. I doubt you'll see it. So, that does, like you said, speak to the strength of the SEC, and in particular the SEC West.
And more importantly for me, not just the number one ranking, are they winning 8 games typically per season and beating other like teams in other conferences, like they put a 4-touchdown beating on North Carolina State in the Belk Bowl last year. That shows you the strength of the SEC versus a like ACC team. So before I kick it to Mike, it's also worthy of noting the point differential. So not only did Alabama get the selection of the media 223 times to 59 for LSU. So that's a huge disparity in terms of winning the SEC. In terms of winning the West, 22-20 in regards to points. So there are points awarded based on where the predicted finish lies versus LSU. So about a 300-point differential, actually about 236 between Alabama and LSU. So looking out to the Eastern Division, Mike, of course, the Tennessee Vols, the expectation is that they take the Eastern Division. Florida, Georgia, it's kind of the haves and the have-nots between those three and the rest of the Eastern Division. So the media selected Tennessee, followed by Florida and Georgia, as Dave outlined, then Kentucky, Vandy, Mizzou, and South Carolina in the basement.
Yeah, Mark, I don't think there's really a lot of surprise with the media predictions for the SEC East. The hype train is pulled into the station in Knoxville. This is the year for Tennessee. Butch Jones has to prove himself. They have the talent. The question really is, do they have the depth to go through the whole season, and do they have can they make the right plays at the right time to finish number one in the SEC East? But they definitely have the talent. Dave's discussion about Florida and Georgia was very interesting. I think Kirby Smart learned a lesson from Mark Richt. If you listen to him in media days, he was kind of talking about how young the team is, the injuries they're going to have in the first of the season. So he's kind of underselling the program, hoping he finishes ahead of expectations instead of what happened to Mark Richt, which was always finishing 1 or 2 spots below the expectations. So I think Kirby Smart might be helping the media, assisting the media, and help him out there a little bit. But the biggest thing I take away from the SEC East predictions is kind of the echelonment, the bifurcation of the SEC East. There's clearly 3 top teams. We're kind of going back to the 90s here: Tennessee, Florida, Georgia. Any one of those teams could win the East. But if you look at the order of finish, you could say any one of those 3 teams could win it. But you got to think that those 3 teams will be 1, 2, 3 in some order. The idea that Kentucky, Vanderbilt, Missouri, or South Carolina could cross that echelon from 4 to 3, a lot of people just don't see that. Opposite from the West, where last year the first place team could have finished last and Mississippi State could have won the division. In the East, we're seeing a separation between the 2 teams, 1 through 3 and 4 through 7. That's really what struck me most about the media predictions for the SEC East.
I tend to think that Georgia is a better football team overall, a more balanced football team across the board with less weaknesses necessarily than Florida, but based on the performance that Jim McElwain turned in getting an Eastern Division championship with that offense in his first year, coming off a successful run as a head coach at Colorado State versus Kirby Smart now taking the head coaching position at Georgia and coaching at this level, being the guy for the first time, I think that at least eliminates an unproven commodity for Florida versus Georgia when comparing the two. The quarterback situation at Georgia a little bit more proven, substantially more proven, not necessarily great, but at least we know what we've got if they're going to go with one of the 2 veterans in Ramsey or in Lambert. So, Chad, anything in the East jump out at you?
No, I mean, I think the if anything, I think to me, after being at Media Day and kind of, being able to follow some of the teams, I really feel like, and Jones kind of addressed this a little bit when he talked to everybody, was that, the expectation, it's there. There's no more excuses there. It's not about youth. It's not about injuries, things of that nature. I think the expectation for Tennessee is overwhelmingly not just within the fans, but I think the media in general as well. I think there was a lot of expectation there, and I think a lot of people were expecting Tennessee to actually get back to that, get to that number one spot in the East. That being said, I can tell that there was a lot of overlooking of, say, a Missouri with Barry Odom, who has, probably has a pretty good blueprint and base for a really good defense this year that probably could give some teams a really tough time. I think that, a lot of people saw Muschamp as the heir apparent to Spurrier and how the culture is going to change a little bit, but I think they also maybe they're overlooking of what he can do this year. But I think that he could actually probably do some things. I think a lot of people overlook the fact that Muschamp had to recover with a Florida team after Urban Meyer that was actually pretty much decimated in the locker room. A lot of people don't think about how bad off that team was when he took it over. And so this South Carolina team, believe it or not, actually has, when you're going from top to bottom roster-wise, has some pretty good talent from Muschamp. They could have, they could be the team that gives some teams some fits. And I think Bob Stoops at Kentucky is being overlooked as well. I think he's a guy, they've got the quarterback situation. I had a chance to talk with him in the hallway prior to doing some one-on-one interviews with some players, and he was just, man, he was very upbeat, very positive about his team. Not a guy that gave off any vibe to me like he was even the least bit worried about his job, so to speak. Just very casual in his demeanor. Made me feel like he was extremely confident in what he has going there at Kentucky, and he should be with the running back and Boone Williams and the two quarterbacks that had to sit and watch the whole situation with Tolles unfold. Now, that being said, is this a 6-7 win team? Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. But, after that, media loved Georgia. Everybody fell in love with Kirby Smart. And I'll be quite honest with you, he kind of won me over, too. I think I was very confident in what he had to say. After that, I really think that some people think that because of the quarterback situation in Florida that there's going to be a little bit of a step back, a regression there. And I'll be quite honest with you, I went back and watched some of the spring tape. I think Del Rio is quite capable of being a very, very good game manager, A.J. McCarron-esque type player for Coach Mack in this system at Florida. And I really think Florida is going to be a really tough team to beat given the defensive players that they do have in the returning. Cox Jr. is a guy that I really, really like. And so I think this team is going to be something to, aware of coming this fall. So that being with the Eastern Division, I'm a lot like Mike. It's a lot more top-heavy, and there's bigger gap separation between the guys on the bottom and those at the top, not like what we have in the Western Division at all. But you do have, it's kind of easy. I think it's a little bit easier to pick games in the Eastern Division than it would be in the Western Division this year. But I do think those three teams are going to be battling it out. And it's going to be interesting pretty early on in the SEC.
Mike, I'm interested to get your take as the resident coaching evaluator and program evaluator. If we look at the SEC Western Division in a similar way that you just broke up the East, which is very clearly defined, 3 versus 4, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee versus the rest of the division. In the West, to me, Alabama is clearly the gold standard. LSU has fallen off, or maybe Alabama separated itself and on the high end, so LSU kind of fits on that second tier. Then after that, the rest of those programs, to me, could vie for 3rd through 7th, and I'm not just talking about these specific rosters and teams and how they're going to finish right now in 2016, but I'm talking about how they stand as programs in regards to resources, facilities, coaching stature, prestige, money, everything involved, and the talent base. So I'm thinking it's Alabama, it's a drop-off, it's LSU, then it's a drop-off, then it's the other 5 with probably Mississippi State pulling up the rear. Who could possibly challenge Alabama, and do you agree with my tier structure?
Yeah, Mark, I totally agree with your tier structure. I think Alabama is clearly, if you look at programs, clearly head and shoulders above the SEC West. I think LSU has to be number 2. If you look at their track record the past decade, if you look at their recruiting, not only their recruiting success, but their recruiting base. Louisiana, East Texas is a tremendous recruiting base for high school football. I believe they're only one of 2 self-funded athletic programs in the nation, which gives them a tremendous benefit when making decisions. Specifically when making decisions on hiring and firing coaches. And then their facilities there are top-notch and a fantastic fan base. It is now a national brand. So I think LSU is a solid number 2 program there. And to be honest with you, I think you're right. That 3 through 7 is really tough. Auburn kind of has the complex there juxtaposed to Alabama. Mississippi State, location, facilities, history, I think is solid 7. But that's for a program ranking, Mississippi State is one of the stronger division bottom dwellers as far as program rank. You look at a couple of them, specifically Mississippi and A&M. I think those are 2 programs on the cusp of getting into that national conversation as maybe not historic programs, but solid year-in, year-out programs. And then I think Arkansas and Auburn are also that way. I think those 4 teams, Mississippi, A&M, Arkansas, Auburn, you could rank year in and year out anywhere between 3 and 6 quality of programs in the SEC West. And again, going to Chad's point, I just think that speaks to how strong the SEC West is.
Yeah, just to underline one last time before we move on. College football on a day in the other play Power 5 football. So we're looking at the Power 5 plus Army, BYU, and Notre Dame. Plus, if we extend it to the 128 FBS schools, if you looked at Purdue, Maryland, Rutgers, and the Big Ten, and likewise throughout the other 4 conferences, you would see teams that you would generally rank as programs, also as teams in 2016, being in that 75 to 80 range. So there being a considerable group of 5 teams like the Boise States of the world that would rank ahead of those schools and their programs, but you do not have that in the SEC Western Division in particular, or really in the SEC as a whole. In the Western Division, Mississippi State could vie for a top 40 ranking. They are one of the 40 best football programs in the country, and that is not the case in the other divisions in college football or in the SEC as a whole, where Vandy would probably still rank in the top 55 to 60 in the country across the board. So Mike gave me a little bit of a scowl. I don't know if that was an agreement or he was sizing up my my rankings there. What do you think, Mike?
No, I think Vanderbilt could make an argument for at very least top 70. Being in the SEC alone with the payout from the SEC network and the visibility and the ability to go into a recruit's home and say, hey, come play for me. You're going to get to play against future NFL guys every week. And the one thing that Vanderbilt has that looking down here real quick, that really no other SEC school has, is Vanderbilt's in a great metropolitan area right there in the middle of downtown Nashville. So that's another selling point for the program, a beautiful campus. So, yeah, I think program-wise, Vanderbilt could probably land somewhere between 55 and 70, 55 on the high end, 70 at the absolute bottom.
All right, so over the last several weeks, we've been building up the SEC Breakdown brand. You need to join us on Twitter and also Facebook with plenty of content gearing us up toward 2016. One in particular, just this past week, talking some Arkansas linebackers with Chad, and very critical spot for the Hawks to step it up and support that defensive line play, and they need to find some linebackers to compete with the likes of Alabama and LSU this week. So we've talked top 5 safeties, we've talked top 5 corners. Please join us on those segments and try to compare your list with ours. So we're talking linebackers this week. David, let's start with you in regards to the top 5 in the SEC heading into 2016.
Yeah, I think we'll make these pretty quick. These seem to be doing pretty good. Seem good following. But I'll start with number 5. I got LSU Kendall Beckwith. He's a leader. A moment from he took over as a starter in his sophomore year, I believe. So he returned for his senior year. He got continued improvement to be one of the top linebackers in the SEC, and for that 2017 draft. He was second team in tackles last year with 84. and 10 tackles for a loss. He'll be, like I said, one of the main top linebackers this coming up year. He struggled at times when an offense could get him isolated a little bit, whether it was in coverage or if they made him run sideline to sideline. But in this new 3-4, I think he'll stay inside more under Dave Aranda, and that should help him play a little more consistent there. Number 4, Reuben Foster from Alabama. He was still able to stand out on the defense with big names at Bama. He's an instinctive big hitter, and he earned he'll earn the starting job at inside linebacker for his senior year. I think he's ready to earn that big name as another Alabama great. Finished second on the team last year with 73 tackles. Only Reggie Ragland had more with 102. I think his speed will end up making him a better overall linebacker than Ragland. Number 3, I got Florida's Jared Davis. I'll tell you, he's versatile, fast, very, very smart player. He is a missile on the field. He will come in and he will lay the wood. He's fast, he's relentless, and I think the thing that stands out to me about Davis more than anything, he's just as good in the fourth quarter of games as he did in the first quarter. His motor just goes and goes and goes. He had 11 tackles for loss last year. Like I said, he's a missile. He lives in the backfield a good bit. 3.5 sacks. And NFL.com named Jared Davis the top college football linebacker to watch in 2016. Number 2, Vanderbilt Zach Cunningham, redshirt sophomore. He emerged as a top tackler when he came in as in the third game of last year and still was Vanderbilt's top tackler with 103 tackles last year. It was crazy. He was a first-team All-SEC performer, led the Commodores with tackles for loss with 16.5. And like I said, that wasn't until he started the third game of the year. He was kind of an unknown when he first got to Vanderbilt. A lot of defenders are, but Derek Mason has turned this guy into a star. And number 1, I got Tennessee's Jalen Reeves-Maven. I think Tennessee got a huge boost when he decided to come back. The numbers, 105 tackles. Wow. And in the SEC, when you're getting beat up after game, and you have 105 tackles, it's just, and with the teams, they played a good bit. 105 tackles, to me, speaks a lot. He's consistently got better since he's been at Tennessee. And the only knock on him, I think, is he's a little bit on the smaller side, but I think his instincts make up for that. And it was, I think, the Oklahoma game last year, 21 tackles. It was just, and not only that game, but that was a game where I was just wow, and kept an eye on him all year long. And it was one of his 3 10-plus tackle games of the year. So Jalen Reeves-Maven is my number 1 linebacker in the SEC.
All right, Chad, you heard David's list. What do you think at linebacker in the SEC?
Mine's not going to change a whole heck of a lot. I would probably, for me, I'm looking at a couple of guys. I think Brooke Ellis is going to be a guy that's going to make some impact this year at Arkansas. He's up for the Buckus Award this year, so I would definitely add him to my list. When I'm looking at it, I'm going across here. I think Beckwith is definitely one of my top 5. Zach Cunningham out of Vanderbilt. David, you talked about him. I'd put him in the same spot at 2. And Reeves-Maven definitely at this point would be my number 1. I'm looking at right now, if I was to go 5 through 1, Reeves-Maven would be 1, Zach Cunningham would be 2. I'm looking at Brooks Ellis to be my 3 guy. And that's not to be outdone by his running mate, Dre Greenlaw, who was a true freshman last year, by the way, fellas, who racked up a nice number of 96 tackles. That's counting assisted and solo as a true freshman. And I think he'll have another big year coming back this year. So he's a guy that would be somebody of note. And also another guy of note is if he wasn't hurt and wasn't going to play, I'd definitely have to add Sky Moore in there. And I hate that he's not going to be playing because I think Sky Moore would be an absolute monster under Muschamp this year. The guy knows how – look, you can knock Muschamp for whatever you want. David, you know as well as I do, the guy can coach some defenses. And Sky Moore would be an absolute monster this year if he was there at Muschamp. At number 4, I'm going to go with Kendall Beckwith there at 4. And at number 5, you know what? I like Davis. I do. I like Davis a lot too, David. I think I like him. I like him a lot. I think he can be an absolute monster this year. Again, what I said earlier when we were doing our SEC picks, I feel like a lot of people are overlooking this Florida defense, and they absolutely should not. And that's one of the guys that's going to be a key benefactor and a key contributor to to this Florida defense, I think, in the fall. But yeah, I've got to bring up the fact that I think of caveat guys of note. If Sky Moore wasn't hurt, definitely somebody that have a big year. And I'd say keep your eye on Dre Greenlaw out there at Arkansas. The guy's a sophomore this year, all SEC freshman last year. I think he's a guy that can definitely get over 100 tackles in his sophomore year easily.
Though not necessarily candidates to break into the top 5 or probably even the top 15 in the league, a couple of freshmen, let's say 5 freshmen that could vie for significant playing time and be stars in the future that just stepped on campus this summer. You include Ben Davis of Alabama. You got Mac Wilson, also the Crimson Tide. D. Walker of Arkansas could get some significant playing time. Trey Threed at Auburn, and also Daniel Batelli, who was a 4-star at Tennessee. So that sets you up, Mike, for your top 5 at linebacker.
Mark, the common theme for my top 5 is the importance to their team. I'm going to look a little bit more than stats and look at what they mean to their team. So I'm going to start at number 5, Gerard Davis. I think David hit all the points. Here's the key for me with Gerard Davis. I think Florida's defense is going to be really good, but they lack depth at linebacker. Correct me if I'm wrong, David, but I think Muschamp failed to sign a linebacker in his either the 13 or the 14 class, and I think you guys have been really thin at linebacker, and that's going to continue this year. I think you got a couple of good young guys, but I think Davis is vitally important to the success of that defense because of the depth at linebacker for Florida. But Dave hit on that. At number 4, I'm going to go Zach Cunningham. He's a great tackler. He means so much to that Vanderbilt defense. Here's how much he means to the Vanderbilt defense. He had 40 more tackles than any other player on that defense. He had 103, and the next guy had 64. So he is critical to our defense. Everybody talks about the Vanderbilt defense. Without Zach Cunningham, that is a mid-tier defense in the SEC. At number 3, I've got Kendall Beckwith. We've already talked about him. He's the one guy here that probably doesn't have as much importance to his team just because LSU has a very well-rounded defense. But great stats, tackles, 3-year starter, 162 tackles, very consistent. And Dave hit the nail on the head. Aranda's going to make a difference for him. He's going to be able to fit inside and make him and clean up a lot more tackles there. At number 2, I have Jalen Reeves-Maben. Talk about a guy who meant so much to his team last year. Kurt Magid goes out the second game. Let me ask you a question. Do you know who these guys are? Bolton Jumper or Weathering? No. Jalen Reeves-Maben is really the only top-notch linebacker Tennessee had last year. 14 tackles for loss, 5-yard average on each one of those tackles for loss. 6 sacks, averaging 8 yards per sack. 4 pass breakups, 3 quarterback hits, and 2 forced fumbles. Did everything for Tennessee. Dave's right. He is undersized, 6 foot 225. Grueling schedule in SEC, but he's played in 37 games, has 220 tackles over his career, 105 and 101 in the last 2 years. The only knock on Jalen Reeves-Maben is he kind of tailed off towards the end of the season. Had 10 tackles in September, 8 in the second month, 6.5 in the third month, and only 6 tackles per game in December and January. He did have 7.8 against the SEC. His average against the SEC was almost as high as it was against non-SEC teams, so he plays up to his competition. Very worthy of being number 1, but I had him at number 2. I had Richie Brown from Mississippi State number 1. That guy meant so much to Mississippi State. If you look at the defenses that Manny Diaz calls, he calls so many defenses. Particularly, though, he likes that 2-read defense. So the safeties aren't – I'm going to get a little bit football nerdy on you. So the safeties aren't there to back up that middle linebacker in the 4-3. The 4-3, the middle linebacker, is so important. He's the only guy in the middle. And without that safety help, if Richie Brown doesn't make his 109 tackles last year, that's a lot of points going up on Mississippi State's scoreboard. 13 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, second amongst linebackers in the SEC. He played better against better opponents. He was incredibly consistent, had as many tackles per game in December as he had in September, and he held that defense together. Richie Brown was so important to Mississippi State last year. They probably would have had 2 or 3 more losses if he hadn't been anchoring in the middle of that linebacker core. So I had him number 1 because, to me, he was the most important linebacker to his team in the SEC last year, and he's probably going to be the most important linebacker to his team this year.
Okay, Mike, if you can't get football nerdy with us, where can you get football nerdy? So it's definitely allowed. All right, we're going to finish up the conversation tonight talking some Big 12 football. So no, this is not Big 12 breakdown. This is SEC breakdown, but we'd love to dive into the national narratives as well, and also some of this movement possibly with the Big 12 looking to go to 12 teams. Makes sense. Big 12, 12 teams could also affect the SEC. All right, so if you're trying to keep track of what the Big 12 wants to do, just think 2014 and think of them trying to determine who their champion was. That's kind of how it's been in regards to this league trying to determine whether they want to add teams. Because we've heard a couple months, no, they don't want to expand. We're good with what we've got. We've got no reason to expand. We like what we do, and we've got a true champion because everybody plays everybody. But boom, on Tuesday, the conference commissioner comes out and says basically, hey, the direction from the board to the commissioner was to recontact some of the schools that expressed interest originally and to find out exactly the nature of the interest and evaluate what proposals they might make in accordance with their interests. Meaning, come on, let's see how much money you got because we want to have you join our league if you've got enough money to cough up to join the Big 12. So, Chad, we will start with you in regards to the Big 12 possibly getting to a position in which they can add a conference championship game, possibly add some schools that would be very intriguing to the football landscape.
Yeah, Mark, this is something I've been kind of following. I think we all have. We all were discussing this before we started the show tonight, and it's really interesting because, like you said, here a while back it was they come out and they say no, we're not interested in expansion. They did decide that they were going to go ahead and start their championship series, I believe, in 2017, 2018. Correct me if I'm wrong there, guys. Regardless of the expansion. And so now that the expansion talks have come about, really I think the influence of the ACC network and the fact that that's going to be a joint venture with ESPN and they're going to have their own standalone network, I believe that really kind of fueled things for the Big 12 a little bit and kind of pushed them in that direction. And now all of a sudden it's become a hot topic in the last few days. And, some schools that have really come about, the names that have been really getting passed around, BYU, Houston, Memphis. So there's been some talk of Cincinnati. There's been talk of, University of South Florida, getting into that Florida market. There's even been the talk of possibly a Tulane team or maybe even a Louisiana Tech to get into the Louisiana market. And interestingly enough, how that kind of pertains to us, since we do so much SEC coverage, is the fact that there are some of these schools that would overlap into SEC country. You look at Memphis. Memphis is right in the heart of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Arkansas. You've got Missouri. You've got Tennessee themselves. Tennessee rarely gets into Memphis anymore, but that's slowly beginning to change. But that's a hotbed. Not so much just for football, but for basketball. Basketball, it's big time in Memphis, and a lot of players come out of Memphis. And again, like I said, it's multiple SEC. It's a big metropolitan area. I would think that that would be a big school to have. Now, that being said, today, there have been some tweets that have come out from AD at Memphis and from Houston talking about in regards to expansion, about the fact that they were open to it, about the fact that, hey, we've got academics that are doing really, really well. We've got all these parts of our university that are doing really well. And by the way, athletics are a part of that as well, so we want to excel there. So making it quite clear, reading through the lines, that yes, Memphis and Houston are very interested in joining the Big 12. Now, what could that do for the Big 12? Look, Houston's a massive market. And not only that, with Herman there at the helm, that is a huge boost for Houston. And it also, quite frankly, it makes a lot of sense because there have been a lot of big-time programs that have been after Herman here this last year or so, and he has not went after any of them. And Houston has turned around and gave him a pretty nice salary to boot. Not only that, the culture in Houston, the football culture, is really starting to blossom with him there. A lot of people are starting to get on track with Houston. A lot of people are starting to really get behind this movement that's there. Not only that, one other factor, Houston is a massive, massive recruiting hotbed for a lot of schools. A&M's down the road, Arkansas, SEC, LSU, SEC. There are a lot of big-time schools in the Southeastern Conference that go to Houston and pull kids out. It is a very it's probably one of the more underrated places where you can go and get a kid that's a 3-star, and he's actually probably a 4-star or higher because of the fact that there is so much talent rich in the Houston area. And so I think that if Houston was to make a move, I think it would be really smart on the Big 12's behalf to go ahead and get Houston involved. They have that air raid style of play. They've got a lot of physical players on the defensive side of the ball. Look, Houston's got guys that get in the NFL. It's not I mean they don't get guys there. Memphis, same way. Look at Lynch. Lynch was big time for Memphis. I think both of those two schools, in my opinion, it behooves the Big 12 to add them along with BYU into that conference if they want to get a conference expansion that actually involves teams that have substance, not just adding teams to just add teams so you can expand your conference, but to add teams that actually have some substance and that can actually contribute to your conference and get into bowls and possibly challenge these other teams to get better.
To add to Chad's discourse on the television side, make no mistake about it, the SEC network is by far the most lucrative network of the conference networks with the affiliation with ESPN. So the most subscriptions, it's around 90 million. It's in the high 80s at this point, 80 million homes for the SEC network, and the money's coming right along with it. The Big Ten is a clear number two. It's not seriously challenging the SEC network, but it's clearly distinguished itself against the other leagues. The Pac-12 is struggling, but at least it's got its own network. It's having some issues, and the ACC is jumping on board with ESPN, as announced this week, and the Big 12 needs desperately, because of the competition in the area for recruits and because money means everything in the long run, will need to jump on board with the television network. David, as Chad outlined, a long list of possibilities here. Houston, BYU, Boise State, Cincinnati, Central Florida, South Florida, Tulane, Louisiana Tech, a number of schools that could vie for the Big 12. None of them outside of Houston really a geographical fit, but that's not necessarily going to be the number one priority.
Right, and that's my question. What are they going for? Are they going for markets or are they going for teams? Also to me, what sells, TV sets and what sells money are good games. So you need these good games to, you bring teams in for good games. The SEC, the one reason people love the SEC is because of the quality of play. You don't need to bring in these, just go get South Florida, Central Florida, these teams with no history just because you want to go get that Florida market or some of that Florida market. So, I have a question for the Big 12. Is it really just for TV? Is it just for teams? Is it for – they already got the conference championship, so, it's not for that reason anymore. And, I don't think there's any teams out there that really bring them on to par, TV-wise or team-wise, to the SEC or the Big Ten. And I think I've heard some things now about one reason they have looked at this is because there were some rumors Houston may have been flirting with the Pac-12 and seeing what they could do there. And I think that may have forced the Big 12's hand a little bit, say, okay, well, some of these schools that we may want to look at may be gone before we can even get to them. So I think they wanted to revisit this. And like I said, my main question, is it market or is it teams?
Okay, so to your point, Dave, if you look at the Big Ten, they went after a football power in Nebraska first and foremost. And if you go way back, they went after a football power in the early 90s and kind of didn't necessarily start this, but they made the first big splash with Penn State added to the Big Ten. But recently, Nebraska doesn't. It brings fans to a certain extent, but it doesn't bring TV markets. It brings prestige. They're going to build a good football program. You know that Nebraska is a commodity. Then more recently, Maryland and Rutgers. Is that going to work out for the Big Ten? I don't think so. I don't think it was a good ad, but we know clearly why they made that decision. New York City, D.C., Baltimore, the Beltway, the possible fans that come from there, even though I think those people are watching baseball in the NFL. Regardless, Mike, your thoughts about the Big 12 in regards to expansion and possibly a good route to go?
Well, Dave, the answer that the Big 12 would give you is markets. That's the answer they're going to give you. And here's why it's so important. Mark kind of alluded to it, touched on it, but here's why it's so important. The SEC, each SEC team is going to get about $36 million this year in payout from the SEC network. I believe the Big Ten is north of $30 million, $31, $32 million. Mark, you can fact check me on that. Pac-12 is a little bit less. I'm not sure what it is, but I think it hovers around 20 to 22 million this year. The ACC is going to start their network and the payouts for the Big Ten network and the SEC have been paying out for 2 or 3 years now. 2 years for the SEC network, 4 years for the Big Ten network, I believe, if they actually pay out the first year. Every year that the Big 12 the Big 12 minus Texas, every year the Big 12 minus Texas goes without getting that $25, $30 million check per team is another year where the SEC and the Big Ten's facilities are going to get better, where their recruiting budget's going to get better, where their basketball team's going to get better, where their Olympic sports are going to get better, and they're going to be healthier in all aspects. So it's going to be markets. The Big 12 has to get more teams to sell their conference, to sell their product to a network, and to have that network or TV company establish a network following the SEC model and the ACC model of a wholly owned network by the TV company. They've got to have more attractive teams. Houston's a great ad. It's a huge market. A&M's there. It's an SEC market now. The SEC tied into the Texas Bowl specifically for that market. The problem with Houston is, are the other 4 Texas schools going to let them in? They better. If they want the Big 12 to survive, they need to let them in. Chad's already talked about Memphis. Just 1 point, Tennessee is going in there. Butch Jones pulled Drew Richmond away from Hugh Freeze and Ole Miss. They weren't in there a couple years ago. They're there now. The other thing about Memphis is FedEx has already offered to sponsor either the football title game or the basketball title game. FedEx is a huge player in Memphis, and they have plenty of money to throw around. BYU, the BYU fans are really interested, very active and very vocal that they want to go to the Big 12. That brings up a couple issues. BYU has its own network, so how does that work? Of course, they got to share time with the Longhorn Network, but then you have the possibility of football only. Does the Big 12 bring Boise and BYU as football-only schools? And the other option is they bring 4 teams in, maybe Boise, BYU in the Northwest Mountains, and then Memphis and Houston in the East. They have that 4-team option as well. And then Cincinnati, big market, get into that fertile Ohio recruiting ground. If it were me, I would try to add 4 teams. I think Houston and Memphis and or Cincinnati. Of course, Cincinnati is close to West Virginia. And then I would go Boise and BYU. I'm more excited about Houston, Memphis, and Cincinnati than I am Boise and BYU. I just think that Boise and BYU might be a package deal. I don't know. So that's my thoughts on that, Mark. I think the Big 12 has to expand. They know they have to. They've waited too long, and now they're forced to. I think those are the real 5 candidates: Houston, Memphis, Cincinnati, BYU, and Boise.
All right, folks, this is a sample of what we do on SEC Breakdown. So you get unique perspectives from everyone. You get college football breakdown across the board, and we do it, I don't know who else is doing this, guys, to this extent. So we bring you content each and every day across the conference, and we give you the big picture college football narrative as well with Mike Loveall, David Waters, and Chad Neipling, and myself, Mark Rogers, each and every week and each and every day on Twitter and also on Facebook. Please join us there. SEC Breakdown, get that in your head because you're going to hear about it constantly through the football season. Guys, great discussion. Hopefully we hit on everything, but we will have future weeks. And with the decisions to be made by the Big 12 and how that affects the SEC, we will have much to talk about. Again, SEC Breakdown, join us for our podcast and video podcast release every Thursday morning, but each and every day on Twitter and Facebook. Guys, great show. Appreciate you jumping on.
Thanks, Mark.